I've been a radio disc jockey for about 4 to 5 years now, but I've worked at a radio station since I was actually 16. I answered a lot of mail and delivered a lot of messages to various employees that made up the tiny building they ran out of. I was like their pet that they watched and grow until eventually I joined the ranks of the other DJs themselves. However, when I was first hired, I was always shaken up a bit by a man who was known as Mr. Sellers. He was not the boss by any means, but he supposedly was very vital to the production of the radio station. They gave him an office without windows, and they gave him a title like creative director or something like that. I'm not even sure that it was real at all. You did not have to know much about him. He was just a very eccentric man. His family constantly worried about him. Therefore, he had his own personal assistant, who was actually a psychiatric nurse, hired by his rich family to make sure that he did not hurt himself or something else. Mr. Sellers was very paranoid. He spoke of government spies, recording devices, surveillance, and he trusted no one. In fact, he could barely look me in the eyes even though I was but a teenager to him. He had an 8mm camera and a cassette tape recorder always at arm's length at all times. In meetings, he would lie down and play this loud tape that sounded like a heavily degraded lo-fi music right to the ear. It was like getting punched in the kidney. I could be across the room and I'd still get a headache from the weird chiptune. But the man seemed immune. In fact, not only did he seem immune, it seemed to calm him down. He was seriously mentally ill, but he had some fantastic ideas, and they kept him because it would cost more to replace him or to lose him. Now, I hear a lot of you probably giving a collective facepalm as you're listening to me read this. And if you think this is some story about a psycho who ends up killing his family wearing their skin or something, you're dead wrong. This is not an awful depiction of a unfortunate mental illness. This is just something that happened to me and sends chills up my spine every time I think about it. Anyway, I worked for quite some time answering mail, but even though I was usually in a quiet room full of envelopes, I was never really too far away from the daily drama of Mr. Sellers. He had many different moods. Sometimes he wouldn't leave his office and not let anyone in. And other times he would just write out his daily contribution on a notebook paper and slide it under the door. Other times he was all over the building. He recorded on his camera and laughed a lot. It was like everyday situations made him laugh and laugh. He could ask what time it was. Some could have responded something like, it's 2:30, and it would just have him laughing on the floor as if it was the best joke in history. There were other times where he'd refuse food because he thought it was rotten, even though it clearly was not. He would sometimes refuse to drink water because they thought they were pumping gasoline into the system. He wouldn't sleep for days because he thought people videotaped him while he was asleep. He collapsed of exhaustion over 3 times and dehydration once. Twice he was escorted out of the building by police, and he was kicking and screaming. It seemed almost violent. Then he was unseen. He was staying at a mental hospital for 6 weeks at a time. He was not creepy at all. I mean, we didn't find him really all that disturbing, contrary to what I just stated. He was just some guy that we all kind of pitied, you know? That one kid that you kind of hang out with at the playground, simply because he has a little bit of a screw loose, and he has issues making friends on his own anyway. So you step in to be that person. However, with all the talk of surveillance and elaborate conspiracies about the loss of privacy, people in the office felt ill at ease, and it did not help that Mr. Sellers waved his camera around all the time. Not always was it like that, only when it was quiet. The times that Mr. Sellers was away at the hospital or when he was refusing to leave his office is the time when it felt like that no one was not alone. Then, one day, we started having broadcasting errors. We would be on the air, and then suddenly it would cut out, or we'd have very low quality sound for up to minutes to hours. Then there would be silence, a loud, long beep, and then just perfect sound once again. This was beginning to happen frequently, but no one could identify the problem. Someone suggested that it was possible that there were two things trying to broadcast at once, but no one was running anything other than our programs. It would happen so frequently that listeners actually even begun noticing it. We were having that reputation of having low quality broadcasting, even though it simply was not true at all. After about 3 months being in the dark as to what the problem was, one evening around 3:47 in the morning, it happened again. Rich, one of our disc jockeys who at the time usually ran at the late night to early morning shows, was playing music. No one usually listened at that time of the morning, so we had very few advertisements and a heavy amount of quote-unquote cheap music. Then all of a sudden, the sound became distorted. Rich had no idea what was going on. Miss Janice, she was listening to it and could hear the sound cut into loud static. The static had a high pitch to it, an eerie undertone, and if you listen closely, you could hear a man talking in a low, emotionless voice. Miss Janice made everyone who was present listen, including the janitor, and they could not understand where it was coming from. No one was at the office at all. And everyone who could have been in the office was standing in the room listening to the weird transmission as I was. Miss Janice started recording it onto a blank tape. She was not recording it when it first came on, but afterwards she did. The voice stopped, cleared its throat, and then went silent. There was no voice, just static, and there was a very faint noise in the microphone, and then another oh. That part was only heard after a recorded tape was played back. The static stopped, went to solid silence. Then after that, the sound of a telephone dial came up, and then click, and then the music began playing. When I came in that night, they made me listen to the tape, and they told me what happened. They made our tech specialist listen to it, and he began to suspect that someone was hijacking our broadcast signal. He said it was possible that whoever was doing it could be causing problems we have been having, and that this person was unsuccessful before. Still, it was a big deal. Even if it was at 3 in the morning, it was still illegal, and it was causing us a lot of problems. We decided to see if it would persist. For the longest time, it did not. We continued as normal, and the problem stopped. For a couple of months, that is, until one day around noon, the signal cut and became clear, near staticless, sound unlike before. This time, it sounded like a tape recorder of someone speaking being played backwards. There were different sounds, faint noises, and the familiar sounding one that sometimes whispered, and sometimes spoke in a concerning voice. It was all played backwards, so he had no idea what was being said at the time. We were able to catch most of it on our own recording, and when we played it backwards, thus making it play normally, we were shocked to hear that the familiar voice was that of Mr. Sellers. The other voices were snippets of conversations with him, recordings of past broadcasts, and what sounded like a recording device being played next to a television set during a film. Mr. Sellers was immediately questioned on the incident, and without blinking, he admitted to the broadcast intrusion. It was never reported, mostly because, again, he's like that mentally handicapped kid. You can't hate him for doing something that he's incapable of really controlling. And as such, everyone felt bad for him. And the next day, he was simply fired. He went off to live with his mother or something. I didn't hear much about it. His office was emptied, but he left a ton of tapes behind. I listened to a few of them out of curiosity. Some were the awful or heavily degraded music. Others were the sounds of conversations, TVs, radios, and single records. It was eerie, like some sci-fi movie material. I nicked a few of the tapes for myself, and they were just gonna throw them away. Throw them into a dumpster and back out of the way. I took 2 of them, and honestly, I actually still have them. Anyway, I eventually became a DJ a year or 2 after Mr. Sellers was fired. It was a great gig. I started working in the early mornings, and I later moved up a few slots with more listeners. Without Mr. Sellers, the place was quiet and it was normal. However, it was lacking the creativity that pushed our limits back in the past. At this point in time, television was becoming more popular than radio, and we needed to give people reason to listen. I was working in the morning and it happened again. It was between 5 and 6 in the morning, and I was drinking coffee to keep me awake during the end of my shift. I spoke occasionally on the air, mostly introducing the songs to the few listeners that were listening at the time. Some were getting up for their early paper route or trucking along. I knew my possible audience, and I played the best rock and roll I could find for them. I was listening to what was being broadcast through the headphones, and it had begun to click. It cut out the sound every other second and then stopped playing, then just dead air. I was tired, on a caffeine high, and every ghost horror movie story I ever knew was playing through my mind all at the same time. My head was starting to pound, and I took my feet off the table, and suddenly it sounded like a tape recording. I heard the chair squeak like someone was sitting at a table. It sounded like someone simply leaned forward in the chair, and of course, I almost had a meltdown. I did not even think to hit the record button. Then it came back. There was a second of dead air, and the sound of rock and roll once again played. My heart was pounding, and I was on the edge of my seat until the end of my shift. Then the sun was beginning to rise, and I calmed down for a second, knowing that the moon was not scaring the shit out of me. There is just something about radio stations that has this eerie feeling to it. With all the recording and broadcasting devices around you, one feels watched when they're alone. Paranoid, if you will. Maybe it was all the energy. I heard some kind of energy make people feel on edge. You know, maybe it was the electrical. Maybe it was some sort of mechanical component that fucked with your brainwaves or something. I reported a problem, but honestly, no one really cared. And after about a day, neither did I. The last time I heard it happen was probably the worst time of all time. Once again, during my first year of being on air, I sat in the morning playing music, and then the second the sound cut off, I pressed record. It was cutting in, cutting out, cutting in, cutting out, and I heard faint talking with every cut. There were about 5 seconds of the tape being played backwards. I could hear them actually hear them pressing the stop button and then snapping upwards. Then I heard the chair squeak faintly. Once again, I only heard it the second time around. The last thing I heard was something that made me feel watched for weeks. I heard what I have later decided to be Mr. Sellers' voice, simply stating, "It still works, Davey." Then it came back. A few clicking sounds later. I was stunned. If you did not already guess, Davey was what I've always been known and called by at the station by my coworkers. I even called myself DJ D, DJ D.Dee on air because it seemed hip at the time and catchy. I played the recording over and over again, and each time it sent chills down my spine. I played it once while I was going to bed. It was next to our annual music tape of mine, and I popped it out of the stereo just for kicks. And even then, it freaked me out. About half a year later, after that last incident, I saw Mr. Sellers' obituary in the papers. He had fallen out of his mother's rooftop. I was sure it was suicide. But then later, I heard through the grapevine that someone had gone up there to search for governmental satellites or something, and he had just slipped off. His mother was a gardener and found him dead a few hours later after his mother had yelled at him trying to cut open a part of the wall. Again, he had this thing with recording devices. She said he went outside in a terrible state of mind and he was dead. Just dead. And just what I heard around the station, of course. Just like that. It didn't matter if the man was mentally ill, creepy, or deranged. The man was dead. I listened to the other tapes I had left behind many times, and it was rather interesting to listen to the odd snippets of his life. I even kept it with my music. However, the It Still Works tape is something I had gotten rid of a long time ago. Not on purpose, but it was probably for the better. I have no idea what he meant by what he said, and still don't, but it did not have a mystery stop working or disappear. I was just so upset and bothered by the sound of him calling me out on the air that I did not want to keep it with my music. I moved from one apartment to another and ended up putting a few boxes in storage during the process. I emptied the content of my unit except for a couple of boxes I did not care about. I stuffed the tape into the box of old scarves from my cousin and the unused bed sheets from my dead grandmother. Then I realized I did not pay my garage storage bill one day, and honestly I didn't care. I truly did not care. That was until I lost the tape. So, either the owner of the rental place threw out the boxes, or they auctioned them off. Even if some stranger listened to the tape, they would have no background. They would not be freaked out like I was. The only result of all this was that I never feel alone while recording. Sometimes the sudden memory of that damn voice of Mr. Sellers will just pop into my head and it will send chills up my spine. Every accidental broadcast click on the radio makes me jump. I love being on the air, but sometimes, especially in the morning, it's simply nightmarish and it requires the most amount of caffeine just to keep me from not running. I'm not sure if I'm going mad myself, but one time a few months ago, I swear to heavens I heard a faint voice of Mr. Sellers saying "It Still Works, Dave" underneath a low-quality transmission to a pre-recorded advertisement. I always listen for it now, and that it only makes me more likely to hear it. Maybe it's just me, but that broadcast intrusion still freaks me the fuck out. Hello, I'm That Creepy Reading, and I want to let you know a couple of things. My next video is going to be the conclusion to Ted the Caver, and the video after that is going to be a creepypasta involving a few of my more popular friends reading about people like DSP getting their own creepypasta. Enjoy that episode of Creepypastas when it comes out. But if you happen to listen to this, understand that I'm actually going to a convention this weekend. If you're in the Detroit area, please consider coming to YomaCon Detroit. I'll be there with a few friends, and I'll have the itinerary of what panels I'm attending and at what time, so that you may hound me and my friends at any time. Or just if you would like to contact me for whatever reason, you may do so. I'm probably going to be at that Linkara Atop the Fourth Wall live thing though for a while, and you can definitely count me at the Fallout 4 panel. I'll be wearing a black hoodie, black jeans, and nice dress shoes. I'll also see if I can get a sign made that says That Creepy Reading if you are still having issues finding me amongst the crowd. I'm your host, That Creepy Reading, and thanks for listening. It's been a hard week. In fact, it's been a hard month. School, family, friends, and all of that has been just getting out of hand. And on top of that, it's driving my mental sanity up the wall. And and I'm having issues just keeping up with the regular recorded, regular broadcasting. So, thanks for staying subscribed. Thanks for supporting. And for all of you on Patreon, CM Crisp, Zamilia, and others, thank you so much for donating. It's really been making a world of difference. And for all my fans who's been helping me out with the headset situation, you guys are amazing too. Thanks for being a part of my community, and I'm happy to give back. With that being said, I'm your host at Creepy Reading, signing off.